Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Jennifer Ogier. I'm the chair of Vets Without Borders, and I'm joining you today from the West Coast in California. That's why I said it's 9 a.m. But it's my extreme honor and pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar today that's being hosted by Veterinarians Without Borders. We have a very esteemed speaker. It's my honor to introduce a university professor emeritus from University of Guelph, Dr. David Waltner Toews. He is actually the founding president of Veterinarians Without Borders, Vétérinaires sans frontières for Canada, and he's also a founding member of the communities of practice for ecosystem approaches to health and internationally recognized. He's worked on every continent except Antarctica on ecosystem approaches to health. In 2010, in London, England, the International Association for Ecology and Health presented him with the inaugural award for contributions to ecosystem approaches to health, and was a speaker in the Speakers of Renown series that celebrated the 40th anniversary of Canada's International Development Research Centre. In 2019, he received an award from the World Small Animal Veterinary Association, recognizing veterinarians who have exhibited exceptional acts of valor and commitment in the face of adversity to service the community. And besides publishing more than 100 peer-reviewed scholarly papers on the health of people, other animals, and ecosystems, Dr. Waltner Toews has written and also co-edited textbooks on ecology and health published by the Cambridge University Press, Columbia University Press, Taylor and Francis, and a number of other publishing houses. These include Independent Thinking in an Uncertain World, edited by Valerie Brown and others, and Ecosystem Sustainability and Health, A Practical Approach, The Ecosystem Approach, Complexity, Uncertainty, and Managing for Sustainability, and a long list of other publications that I won't read. His book on pandemics, deadly diseases from bubonic plague to coronavirus, which was published by the Greystone House in 2020, is a major revision and update of his previous book, which is The Chickens Fight Back: Pandemic Panics and Deadly Diseases That Jump from Animals to Humans. Dr. Waltner Toews' other books of popular science include Food, Sex, and Salmonella: Why Our Food is Making Us Sick, The Origin of Feces, What Excrement Tells Us About Evolution, Ecology, and a Sustainable Society, and Eat the Beetles, an exploration into our conflicted relationship with insects. He's also published 6 books of poetry, including The Fat Lady Struck Dumb, The Impossible Uprooting, a collection of recipes and dramatic monologues, and has an award-winning collection of short stories as well as a murder mystery. Please join me in welcoming our very esteemed speaker this morning, Dr. David Waltner Toews. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Jennifer. That's quite an introduction. Anyway, I'm going to try to share my screen now to see. Whoops. Go back.
It's working.
Can people see that?
Yes.
And can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'll just plunge right in since we've already got going here. I'm glad to see the system is working. It's always a bit of a challenge. I wanted to focus on a different aspect of this pandemic than we usually, than we've been hearing in the daily news. And it's partly because we get overwhelmed. I get overwhelmed by all of the information overload or data overload. I just wanted to point out, I live in what we would call the city of Kitchener, which used to be called Berlin, but it's actually land that's a traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, which are the Iroquois, actually, and I didn't realize that till just a little while ago, and the Anishinaabe and Neutral peoples. And this picture is by a Canadian artist called Robert Gonzalez, and to me, it typifies, in a sense, where we are right now, coming out of the forest and walking into this unknown and somewhat dangerous landscape. We hear a lot about the specific virus, the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, and its structure and how it attaches to people and how it makes people sick or doesn't make people sick. But I think as a veterinarian and someone concerned about One Health and eco-health, I wanted to stand back and look at about where these diseases come from, like SARS-CoV-2, and how we might think about them in ways that will enable us to move ahead in a more sustainable fashion. The information on the virus itself and how it's transmitted among people is very important for managing the pandemic now as it unfolds, but it may be less useful in terms of anticipating what we might look forward to in the decades ahead. So it's not just about the virus, but it's about how we interact with and share what we now call microbiomes of other animals. Microbiomes didn't exist when I went through veterinary school. There were just some bacteria and viruses out there. Now we understand that there are whole integrated populations that live on different people, different animals, different landscapes. But if we look at the conventional view of what we call zoonotic diseases, we have those that come from livestock, from wildlife, or from both. So we have salmonella, anthrax, Lyme disease, BSE, and we've tended to think, and I in fact myself, when I gave lectures, tended to structure them in terms of what do we get from dogs, what do we get from cats, what do we get from chickens, and so on. What's changed over the last 15 years is both how pandemics unfold, how infectious diseases unfold, and how I've thought about them, and I'm not alone in changing my thinking about them. In conventional terms, we might think about how do we get, how do the agents arrive at us, the hosts. One might think that if we're the host, they should be guests, but we tend not to use that term. We can have a direct interaction. We bite them, which is we eat them. So we eat food and we get direct contact with E. coli or salmonella or Campylobacter, or they bite us. And the most well-known one traditionally has been rabies, and that's still a problem around the world. Another grouping of them in conventional terms are those diseases that come to us from other animals but are transmitted through arthropods, ticks, mosquitoes, fleas, and in North America, we might think of Lyme disease, which passes through ticks and other mammals. We might think of other diseases in other parts of the world as well that are transmitted that way. And you can see that at this point, we're already moving from individual animals into a more landscape-focused examination of how they're transmitted. And then we have, without being mediated through insects or any other intermediate animals, we have shared environments. And in North America and Europe, we might have animal visitation programs where we have dogs in ICUs, which is maybe a questionable practice, but there are issues there with regard to shared microbiomes. On the top left, we have something there. There's animal slaughtering, and there are dogs, and that picture comes from about a decade I spent working on Hydata disease in Nepal, which is a problem anywhere where there are particularly sheep and goats, but also other livestock and dogs. And the tapeworm comes from the dogs, goes into the environment, and the intermediate animals, including people, get infected. And then we have the other domestic shared environments, if you want, where we have children who are getting their heads into pet food dishes and picking up, say, salmonella from pig's ear treats and things like that that are given to our dogs and cats. In order for a disease to become pandemic, it not only has to get from the other animals to people, but it has to spread person to person. So for instance, and this is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights, and there are many opportunities here, as you can see, for pandemic spread once the agent gets into the human population. In order for that to happen, the agent has to adapt itself to people and then be enabled to spread. And that happens more often with viruses than with other diseases, because viruses will shift, they will lose pieces of themselves, if you want, and pick up new bits of genetic material from whatever host they're in and adapt to that in various ways. If they don't do that, they don't become pandemic. So for instance, avian influenza can be transmitted to people in direct contact. So it's often people who are killing the chickens or who are in direct contact with chickens, cooking them in some way, who become infected, but it hasn't adapted to spreading person to person, so it hasn't become pandemic in that sense. And there are several diseases which we've managed to contain within animal populations which are zoonotic, but they haven't become pandemic. To get a pandemic going, the agents must somehow get from the reservoir animals, and reservoirs are those animals where the agent lives without causing too much trouble. And in the case of coronavirus, that's often, it has been seen to be bats. As veterinarians and other people in looking at these kinds of diseases, we've for many years now looked at systemic approaches that foster collaboration. The current catchword is now One Health. When I was teaching, it was often ecosystem approaches to health, or eco-health, or ecosystem health. This is very important for fostering collaboration to look at specific issues. There are problems, however, in that we tend to default to certain boundaries. So we look at the health of an animal, of a farm, of a household. And what we miss out on this is the kind of narrative, the movement over time, what changes over time, and the fact that many of these boundaries are not fixed. They're very loose, they shift around, and this is particularly true with pandemics. And so I'm going to talk a bit about narratives, and then the question comes up, and this is something we need to continually ask ourselves. If we have a story about how this pandemic emerged and is spreading, who's telling the story? What do they gain from that story? So with regard to this SARS-CoV-2, the basic hypothesis is that it came out of bats. Now, bats are 20 to 25% of mammalian species. Some people don't realize that, that species are that common. They've got wide, multiple roles within ecosystems in terms of spreading seeds, pollination, and all of those kinds of things. Let's assume that they are in bats. Now, one of the issues here is that the reason bats have been identified is there are coronaviruses in bats that are 96% similar to those in people, but we're also 96% similar to chimpanzees, which were obviously not chimpanzees, and we're even 90% genetically similar to Abyssinian cats. And so this similarity suggests some possibilities, but doesn't give us a definitive answer. And this is where we begin to have some room for different narratives. Assuming that it came out of bats, we can ask, did it come out of bats directly? So was there a direct connection from the bats to people and then began to be circulated? Did it go through some intermediate species? And the species that have been suggested by various researchers are pangolins, which are these spiny anteaters, which have been one of the most widely traded wildlife animals in the world, and traded primarily for those scales you see there, which are actually just keratin, but are believed to have all kinds of effects, medicinal effects by people, by certain groups of people, and so it's traded for those scales. Raccoon dogs in the lower right-hand corner are raised for their fur, and they're also hunted for their fur. cane rats are both pests and they're also delicacies for some people. And early on in this pandemic, it was suggested that there were some coronaviruses that are similar in snakes, and people also eat snakes. In fact, I think I've had eaten snake when I was in Kenya. So there are all these possibilities, and each of them suggests a different narrative, if you want. If it's cane rats, then we're looking at a certain kind of agriculture. If it's pangolins, we're looking at wildlife trade. So we have different possibilities here. What are some other examples of viruses, not necessarily coronaviruses, which have come from bats and moved into human populations? Well, one of the first ones that comes to mind for many people is Ebola virus. If we look at the most recent epidemics of Ebola virus in Africa, there was political violence in Liberia and the République de Guinée in the 1990s and early 2000s. This was followed by billions of dollars of mining investments over the next decade, and more than half of Liberia's forests were sold off to industrial loggers. So we have war, people being displaced by war, moved out of their homes, and then we have economic development, but it's the kind of economic development which results in further disruption of where people live and the way they make their livelihoods. Within the next decade, then 2014 to 2016, almost 29,000 people were sick with Ebola and 11,000 died. This was in West Africa. And in the years following, a bit further east and south, we had 2,300 dead in the Democratic Republic of Congo, near Virunga Park, which is a gorilla sanctuary. There were rebels fighting, and the governments were talking about possible oil exploration within the park. In 2020 now, there's been a new outbreak in the west of Democratic Republic of Congo. In this case, it looks like the Ebola virus might have come directly from consumption, and you can see a basket full of bats there, that people were eating bats, partly because they were outside of their normal communities. They had been moved around because of war and because of development, so they were looking for new sources of food. Some of them were also eating bushmeat, partly because they liked the taste, for some of them, the way some people in North America enjoy eating venison and other kinds of wildlife. But also they were eating animals that had been made sick by being infected with Ebola from bats, and these were easier to catch. So duikers, other small antelope, and those kinds of animals. So it was either direct from the bats or through some other animals that were infected with bats. And it's not clear there, but there is a possibility there that the coronavirus might have followed a similar pattern. Another virus that came from bats was what we now know as Nipah virus, and it was actually the virus on which formed the basis for the movie Contagion, which many people watched at the beginning of this pandemic, and it's actually quite different from what we're seeing. But what happened there was the city of Singapore was trying to have a clean city, and they farmed out, literally, the agricultural production, the animal production, to neighboring Malaysia and to Indonesia. So pig farms in Malaysia and in Indonesia were growing meat for consumption in Singapore, partly so that Singapore, which is a small island city-state, could have clean streets and sustainable society, if you want. The pig farmers, in this case in Malaysia, they had the pigs living inside and outside, and they grew mango trees around those pig farms. So one might say, well, it's livestock agriculture, but it's also somewhat sustainable and it's somewhat green because they have these fruit trees. Unfortunately, at the same time, there was a major El Nino event and massive drought in Southeast Asia. There was clearing of forests, burning of forests to grow trees for palm oil, which was seen as a substitute for fossil fuel. So we have this, road to hell paved with good intentions. We had, because of the drought, the El Nino climate influenced drought, and the burning. We had smoke haze all over Southeast Asia that you could see from the satellites, large areas. It turns out the flying fruit bats, which were migrating in the area, were looking for fruit to eat and fruit trees, and they found the mango trees around the pig farms partly because they were disoriented from all the smoke and they couldn't find trees because many of them had been cut down. They were carrying this particular virus. They were sloppy eaters, and some of the mangoes dropped into the pig pens, and the pigs picked up this virus, which came to be known as Nipah virus, killed a lot of the pigs, killed a lot of people living there. It was eventually contained within that area and didn't spread from there, but it offers another window of possibility of how viruses can get from a wildlife species like bats and into people. And this is basically not through war or land clearance, but through agricultural development and certain kinds of agricultural development. And this brings me to another narrative, if you want, which intersects with what we've seen with this coronavirus. In 1600 in France, Henry IV said, "If God keeps me, I will make sure that no peasant in my realm will lack the means to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday." It turns out God didn't keep him. He was assassinated a few years later by a fanatical Catholic who didn't think that Henry's conversion from the Huguenot religion to Catholicism was sincere. In any case, within the century after that, we have René Descartes establishing what we now think of as scientific principles, that we focus on something, we study it, we don't just take given information that's given to us, we go out and make observations. And his view in doing this was that we could render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. So the idea was if we can understand nature, we can control it. And that's really the foundation of much of the way we have done science over the last few hundred years. And it's that kind of science which enabled us, particularly in the post-World War II period, to massively put a chicken or a pig in every pot. Egg production, meat production of all kinds, aquaculture increased dramatically. And it was partly because we could synthesize vitamins, which until really the mid part of the 20th century, people had no idea how to identify and manufacture them. We could now do that, for instance, produce vitamin D so that the chickens wouldn't have to be outside in order to get their vitamin D dose. They could be inside, they could be fed, and then we could crowd them together and have economies of scale, which would bring down the price, if they have economies of scale, in order that poor people could have a chicken in the pot on Sunday and perhaps every day. Part of what we saw in this process of going from before, if you want, in the top picture here, we have the farmer, the butcher, and the animal rights activist in the same picture. Below that, we have morning outside the bar in Pucallpa, Peru. And what we have really is a kind of small-scale agriculture where you can see in front of you what's going on. After we moved to this industrialization of agriculture, the people were gone. It's basically been computer controlled and required huge inputs of fossil fuel energy to maintain this. And it was one way to bring down the price of food for people so that people could consume these different kinds of meats. Tied to this then has been what I would call a naive or biologically blind globalization. People wanted more trade with fewer regulations, and this is actually, it's much worse than the spaghetti diagrams I used to show my students. This is a mathematical model of trade between countries with regard to foods. And I don't want to go into the details here. The point is that the idea was if you could specialize in an industrialized system, so growing avocados in one place and growing something else and somewhere else, depending on the cost of labor and the availability of energy, the availability of resources. And then through trade globally, you could assemble, for instance, pigs in Mexico with inputs from various parts of the world, and then ship them to China and the United States and various other places. And then, of course, that resulted in the 2009-10 pandemic of what we call swine flu, which is actually a mixture of avian and swine and human virus. The idea was that by economies of scale and trade, everybody would make money, we would all get richer. In fact, globally, there was a large increase in money, but if you looked at the details, in fact, the wealth wasn't very well distributed. So we have the 99% and the 1%, which everyone is very much aware of. So we have this disjunction between the creation of wealth and who has that wealth. In this context, then we have these complex set of interactions, and we have some unexpected outcomes. In January and February of 2020, this year, there were outbreaks of H5N1 avian influenza in the area south of Wuhan, in the province south of Wuhan. And I've already talked about that. That's partly the result of the way we've raised poultry, the massive increase, the economies of scale and so on, encroachment on wild areas and spreading out that way. So we had that going on. And then there was another narrative, and I think I've got time to go back here and just cover this very quickly. In the 1880s, colonial governments were invading various parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The Italians came in through Eritrea and Ethiopia. They brought with them cattle that were carrying Rinderpest. It used to be called cattle plague, so the Rinderpest virus, which is actually related to the measles virus. The Rinderpest virus came in. It killed off 90% of the ungulates in sub-Saharan Africa. I think a third of the Maasai people starved to death. Huge starvation, many animals dead. And into that vacuum then, the colonists brought in, imported domestic pigs from the Seychelles and from England and various other places. It turns out there was kind of a natural cycle of a virus, African swine fever virus, in sub-Saharan Africa that went between wild boar, wild pigs, and soft-bodied ticks. And it didn't really cause a lot of problems in either of those populations. It did turn out actually to cause huge problems in domestic pig populations. And the domestic pigs often died when they got this disease. And there were outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa, in Europe, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and they were almost always controlled through stamping out, killing all of the animals, isolating the farms, those kinds of things. One of the things that happened with this African swine fever was that it then spread to different parts of the world through trade. And in the early part of 2018, it entered China. Some people say it came from Russia, some people say it came from Africa, some people came from Europe, different places. Regardless of where it came from, it got to China. By the end of 2019, half the pigs in China, 200 million pigs, which was a quarter of all the pigs in the world, had died of African swine fever or had been killed in order to control the disease. So then we come up to this, the market, if you want, in Wuhan. So we have, and I'll expand on this a little bit, but we're coming up to the Chinese New Year, the end of the year of the pig, the beginning of the year of the rat. Tens of millions of people wanted to get together and get food. Well, everybody wants fresh food. We've been told fresh food is better, it's safer. In fact, I've probably given some of those lectures. And in various places in Southeast Asia, we have what are called wet markets. And wet markets are really like expanded farmers markets where you can buy fresh vegetables and fresh meat. If you don't have refrigeration, there are a limited number of options for producers and consumers to get fresh food. Vegetables are not so much of a problem. For meats, you either bring in the animal live and kill it in the market, or if the farmer kills it at home and brings it in, if he doesn't sell it, it goes bad. So they dispose of it then. So it's a huge loss that way. So in places where there is limited preservation, here you can see pigs hanging, and they've found ways to preserve them that way. But in some places they don't have those kinds of options. And so you have the possibility then of viruses spreading. And that ties in then to the fact that people don't have electricity, they don't have refrigeration, you don't have equitable distribution of wealth within those areas. The reason I mentioned salmon here is because in June, in the middle of this pandemic, in China, there was another outbreak in the biggest market in Beijing, and they shut the market down. It distributed 90% of the fresh produce within the Beijing area. It turned out it was found on a cutting board used for cutting salmon. The question then is, where did the salmon get it? The salmon actually came from Norway, and the question was, did it come through the distributor? Was it on the cutting board? Did somebody else bring it into the market? And when you have these kinds of gaps, and it's almost impossible to establish exactly what happened, you have the possibility of different stories emerging. So then we have the end of the Chinese year of the pig and the beginning of the Chinese year of the rat, which I'm somewhat fond of because I was born in the year of the rat. Not that that's relevant to anything. I'm theoretically fond of rats for this reason. But then we have this possibility of all these people coming together. You have decreased foods available. You have had outbreaks of avian influenza. We've had African swine fever wiping out a huge proportion of the pigs, which would have been available otherwise. And we have people in the market saying, listen, we don't have pigs and chickens here, but we've got these other animals, right, that are wildlife. And it's not technically legal, but people might look the other way because everybody wants to celebrate. And so the wildlife market is not technically this, it's not the same as the wet market. The wet market is something like in a large farmer's market, or even like a big grocery store that we might see. And anybody that's been in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world is aware of what these are. The wildlife market is somewhat different, and it's a little bit below the radar and illegal in some places. But when you have this kind of consumer pressure to have food for a big celebration, then you can see how this would end up, the rules might be loosened a little bit. When we look at all of these possibilities, we need to ask, who's telling the story when we go from the bats to the pangolins to people, or bats to raccoon dogs to people, or we're looking at other possibilities here. And they say, well, shut down the wet markets or shut down wildlife trade. And all of these might be important in some ways, but there's no definitive story. And I've got a couple of examples here. One is this, the two, I'm going to focus on the middle, this little girl with the chicken. This is another story here with regard to chickens. But the upper right-hand corner is in a market in eastern Thailand where I talked to the woman who was selling fresh poultry. And this was at a time when they were being pressured, people in the market were being pressured to shift to commercial chicken, to internally housed commercial chickens. And when I talked to her, she said, yeah, we can sell commercial chickens, but I get 10 times as much on a per kilogram basis for free-running birds as I do for these others, so that the commercial birds. So there's an economic pressure going in the other direction. The lower left-hand corner is, I was in a village in Java in Indonesia, in an area where avian influenza was widespread. And we went to the village, and the villager said, well, we don't have avian influenza. I said, well, that's interesting. And they had some cures that they said that they had for it. And I asked if we could see the chickens. We went out and looked at them. It turns out what they had was competitive singing roosters. And you have to hear it to believe it. They're wonderful, these crooning voices. the point is that these were worth $2,000 or $3,000 US each, which is a huge amount of money to these farmers. And if somebody comes in and says, well, if you've got avian influenza, we'll depopulate and give you a market value for the chickens, those can't be replaced at market value. These are genetic strains that have been bred for years for this competitive singing. Another way to look at these different kinds of stories is I was in Argentina at a workshop, and we were looking at the links between animal health, human health, and environmental and biodiversity and sustainability on the eastern slopes of the Andes, which are called the Yungas. So the eco-health in the Yungas, if you want to put it that way. And we had veterinarians, we had physicians, we had wildlife biologists, we had indigenous leaders. And the physicians would focus on things like, well, if we bring in clean water, toilets, people can wash their hands, they're going to have less disease, this is going to be better. The wildlife biologist said if we can identify the species and set up conservation programs for those species, there were all these different possibilities. And the indigenous leaders said, really, this is an issue of land rights, of who owns and manages this land. And it's not a matter of going in and counting species or putting in toilets. It's a different kind of issue. It's a social issue, a political issue in terms of who is managing this land. And as you can imagine, there was a fair amount of discord within that workshop. And at one point, one of the indigenous leaders said, well, when we get to this point in our discussions, normally, traditionally among indigenous groups, we just kill the other people. And so this is an academic workshop. We said, okay, just maybe we should back off a little bit. We were able to work through, at least at a theoretical basis, some of these issues. We didn't resolve them, but what became clear was these were not theoretical issues. These were livelihood issues. These were grounded in people's histories, their understanding of who they were and the landscapes they lived in. And that's something we sometimes forget when we look at different versions of how the pandemics emerged. So if we're looking at trying to find a globally collaborative story, it's a matter of looking at who are the different people involved. What are the different animals, the megafauna? Do we just pick out the pretty ones, the cute ones, the charismatic megafauna, if you want? If we look at tree communities, which ones? Almonds or castaña, which are Brazil nut trees, which grow in the wild and require certain kinds of orchids to be growing on them to attract bees to be pollinated. Insects, which ones? We all like bees. Do we like kissing bugs, which transmit American sleeping sickness? The microbiomes, which ones are we concerned about? And who decides who's part of this story? The temptation is that we want to have one story that explains everything. And I call this the Babel Temptation. That's in the traditional story of the Tower of Babel, where everybody got together, they had one language, and they wanted to understand everything. And in a sense, that was an original painting there by Peter Bruegel. This is Julie Holcomb, who's an American photographer who does these wonderful collages. It's a newer version of it. The idea is that going back to 17th century science, that everybody would speak the same language. We would have this global scientific consensus, and we would all be able to solve this global problem as a global problem. And it turns out that the world is much more complex and diverse than that. And maybe more what we need is, this is a Babel fish from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which can simultaneously translate among multiple languages. We need something like that to be able to understand multiple languages among people and among different species. How then do we proceed? Many of us as veterinarians, we look at a diagnostic setting. They're decisions made by a clinician together with the client. And these are judgment calls, and we modify them as needed. We draw on multiple sources of information, labs, exam, history, and have a pretty good idea of the quality of the information we're getting, whether it's through observation or laboratory diagnostics. for pandemics, both the diagnostics and the response decisions involve multiple expert peers, owners, people living in sub-Saharan Africa and China and United States and Canada and Europe and Latin America with different perspectives, different ideas as to which kinds of information are important in making those decisions, and with different spatial boundaries. And this is where that One Health approach runs into some challenges because the boundaries keep shifting. The quality and reliability of the information from those different sources are much more difficult to assess, and the clinical judgments made by different owners may be conflicting, as I said, with regard to the indigenous people and, say, the physicians or the veterinarians or the wildlife biologists. We all may have different ideas as to what's a successful outcome here. So we need to ask different or more kinds of questions. And one of the things that has come to the fore in terms of my thinking was this notion of peripheral vision. If individually we don't have peripheral vision, we tend to stumble around because we don't see what's around us. Our scientific and technological success has relied on our ability to focus. We can study viruses, animals, various kinds of things, and in the process we lose our peripheral vision. What we're good at is looking at what's in front of us, and that's very important. We can't see everything, so in this larger sense, we must be each other's peripheral vision. So I can't see everything, so I need to rely on, if I'm looking at something in front of me, I see a disease, or I see a certain kind of animal growth, or I see encroachment onto a landscape, I need to be able to interact with economists, landscape developers, wildlife biologists, and to say, if this happens over here, what's likely going to impact is that going to be over there? And similarly with them, if they come up with, well, here's a new economic policy, let's say having a guaranteed annual income in order that people can have a chicken in every pot without having economies of scale. What are the likely outcomes in terms of animal growth and sustainability? Unless we collaborate across disciplines, across cultures, across organizations, we'll always be blindsided. And I think Vétérinaires Sans Frontières, we are particularly well placed to do this because we have colleagues and friends and collaborators all over the world in different communities who see things differently. And we must be able to communicate with each other. And in a sense, the pandemic has been good that way, and I'll come back to it in a sense. Sometimes in order to change one thing, in this case, in the upper pictures, I was studying Hydata disease. We tried all kinds of things to control that disease. It turned out we had to work with the community so that they could transform the whole community, improve water supply, improve slaughtering facilities, planting grasses along the riverbank. In order to deal with one thing, and in this case, we might be talking about coronavirus, we may have to restructure all of our institutions. So if we look at this pandemic now, the most frustrating things for many of us about this is, one, it's caused by a zoonotic agent, and therefore it really can't be eradicated. There's no, historically, zoonotic diseases are unlikely to be eradicated. It's shattered our idea that we can have complete control of nature, this idea that we got from Descartes. And so it's undermined our scientific certainties. So you'll find a lot of uncertainty in terms of the way science is presented publicly, and some people have trouble with that. And it's lasting long enough to destroy what some people would see as being the most successful global economy in the world's history. So it generated more wealth globally than probably most other previous economies. If we turn this around now, and we can say that the best things about SARS-CoV-2 are that it's caused by a zoonotic agent. We can't eradicate it, which means we have to rethink our relationship with nature, with other species, our role in this. Because we can't control nature, because there are all these uncertainties, even looking at something as straightforward apparently as how did the virus get from the bats through other species to people, we have to rethink how we do sciences and how what the role of sciences are in terms of our clinical decision making. And it's actually lasting long enough to allow us the time to think about how we can reorganize ourselves into a more collaborative, convivial, global economy. So the things that are the most frustrating about it are actually some of the things that can enable us to move forward and do some good things. Two quotes at the end here, one from the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, this I know at great cost: all life is not outward, nor is all death from within. And we can see this with the way we have responded to pandemic virus, that not everything is about not getting sick and dying. We have social relationships, we have foods we like to eat, we need to be outside. There's all the mental health well-being that is related to things that are not necessarily immediately having to do with whether we get the virus or not. And the other is a quote from an anthropologist who looked at people who are looking at insects as the possibility of being the savior of us all in terms of food. And when I was working on the book about eating insects, I found there's a lot of diversity around the world in terms of the roles of insects in different societies, in terms of the roles of insects in different ecologies. But the approach being used by some researchers was, we'll get the right insects, we'll grind them up, we'll make this perfect food, and then we'll sell it around the world and feed everybody. And this completely ignores the diversity of cultures and ecologies around the world. And this anthropologist's conclusion was, to impact the food supply of the world, it's necessary to attend to many different worlds. And I would say that's what we need to do as we move ahead with regard to dealing with this pandemic. And at that, I will take myself out of screen sharing and open it up to questions if anybody has any questions. Maybe I didn't leave enough time, which would be quite okay. Not really, no. Anyway, any questions, comments? I can't hear anybody.
David, this is Dale Smith speaking. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Great. As chair of the program committee for Vets Without Borders Canada, on behalf of Vets Without Borders, and I'm sure all the attendees of today's webinar, I'd really like to thank you, David, for your fascinating and very relevant presentation. I don't think I ever wanted to be able to say that something on a pandemic was relevant to day-to-day living, but I guess that's the world we're living in. David and I go back a long way. Young faculty members at VWB, we were present at a meeting at the Second Cup on the corner of College and Gordon in Guelph, Ontario, where the idea of Vets Without Borders was first floated. So it just goes to show that you never know where a cup of coffee is going to take you. David's involvement with Vets Without Borders has continued since then, both formally as the founding board president and as a board member for many years, and informally, such as today. And it's really no surprise that his career focus on One Health around the world has been a perfect match to the mandate of Veterinarians Without Borders. We embrace a holistic approach and emphasize the interconnectedness of humans and animals and environmental health, as David has shown, globally, particularly internationally in Africa and Asia, and also in our own backyard within programming in the Canadian North. So I just encourage all those who are listening today that if you found David's talk interesting, to encourage you to take a look at our website, vetswithoutborders.ca, or Veterinarians Without Borders Canada. Google that, and to join us as we work towards creating a better world. And so if there is anyone who would like to ask David a question, we'd really love to encourage that, either through the chat function, or I think probably by unmuting yourself and just speaking to David directly. We have 10 minutes, so there's certainly time for a few questions.
I see there's a question from someone about where can we look for success? How can we move ahead with this? A lot of it has to do with listening at this point. I mean, I find it very interesting, and in fact, hopeful that we see Black Lives Matter, that we see Indigenous land rights, we see a whole range of these social issues coming to the fore at this time. And if we look at the resilience diagrams where systems go through all kinds of organization, and at some point they crash, and it's at the point that they crash where there are huge opportunities for reorganizing and starting something new. And a lot of what I think, certainly some of us, you know, I'm an older white guy, we need to do is to listen carefully to what other people are saying, to what they're doing, to what the suggestions are, and not to assume that we've got an answer, but that we can somehow collectively negotiate some sort of an answer. And I think that will be the way to go ahead. And I think with our international connections with Veterinarians Without Borders and within Canada, in the north and so on, listening to communities, what are the roles of animals in these communities? How do they relate to each other? And how can we support that in different ways without coming in and saying, here, we've got an answer for you, without understanding the local dynamics. Somebody asked what makes bats such great host reservoirs. And I mean, that's an ongoing question. It appears that bats have their immune systems have the ability to kind of wall off some of these agents, perhaps because they fly around so much to different contexts that they're exposed a lot. I think that's an ongoing question. But the truth is that they seem to be able to tolerate agents that would be devastating in other species, and it's not exactly clear why that happens, but it's documented that in fact it does happen. So I think it's something we, in one hand, we need to live with, and I don't know, maybe we can adapt ourselves to be more tolerant of other species if we can figure out how bats do it. Maybe we can do it also. That's really pushing it. No more questions? Can anybody hear me?
All right. I guess, oh, I see a question there. Do you see that, David, from Krista Wallace?
How do we get politicians and policymakers to pay attention? That's yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a clear answer. I mean, you ask anybody who's been involved, for instance, in Canada within the Canadian Cooperative Wildlife Health Collective or Center or whatever it's called now. It's almost always this: if there is a human disease component, then they might pay attention more often. The problem is that their attention seems to be focused on a specific animal, whether it's a civet or a pangolin or ducks carrying influenza viruses, rather than on maintaining habitats. I mean, if we look ahead, much of the disease that people have picked up from wildlife species has come because of encroachment onto wildlife habitats. And of course, we can't think of any areas in North America where wildlife habitats are being opened up to mining and oil exploration, and I'm being facetious, but those would be the places where one would say, listen, there's some danger signals here. Maybe we should be more cautious about doing that, not just because we care about the landscape, but because there will be repercussions for human populations, initially for the people that live there, but then because of the way we're interconnected, it will come to the rest of us.
Well, it looks like you've silenced them all today, David, probably giving everyone an awful lot to think about.
Well, I hope that's what happens, is that people go away and think, and they listen and talk to other people. I always say talk to people who don't agree with you, but I try to do that, and I know how difficult it is. And somebody talks about the spread of Lyme disease. We do know, I mean, I was involved in research this is a while ago now, but already then it was clear that combination of climate change, the heating up, and land use change in southern Ontario was causing the disease to move northward. And I imagine that will continue to happen. And the interesting thing is that ties in with us epidemiologists telling everybody, you need to get outside and walk in the woods, right? So we have these complex interactions, and it's not clear exactly what the path through that is.
I'd just like to remind everyone that this session has been recorded and will be available through the Veterinarians Without Borders Canada website. So if you have been thinking about some of the things that David's been talking about and would like to go back and listen to him again and try and consider what he's been saying, you've got that option as well. And while you're there, please have a look at our website and see all the other things that Vets Without Borders are taking part in. And perhaps you would like to either become a member or even join the board if you have a background that makes you interested in some of the activities that were taking place. Oh, I see another question for you, David.
Well, I see one from Dorothy Gill about closure of wet markets. And I know, Fauci, whom I like a lot, he suggested that. I think closing wet markets, as a whole, is probably not a good idea. Partly because it's a source of fresh food, and areas where there isn't refrigeration and so on. I think focusing on the wildlife market might be more effective in the long run, like reducing wildlife trade, managing it, putting in place more enforceable rules rather than trying to ban it, because that tends not to work. Somebody also asked about the low death toll in Africa. It's a whole range of reasons from what I've seen. It has to do partly with the age of the population there. There are many more young people. And I don't think it's entirely clear. People are making various kinds of suggestions. And we'll see how that plays out. I don't know. And eating locally sourced foods, I think we are moving toward a situation where we will more likely have less naive globalization, as I would call it, where we're just trading willy-nilly and we don't pay attention to where things are moving around. I still like to drink coffee and eat chocolate, and eat avocados now and then. So I'm eating things that are local, I think, is good. So I think we'll both produce things more locally, we will eat things more locally. And when we trade, perhaps at its best, we will do so more carefully, looking at quality, looking at how do we manage it, how do we maintain quality control at, around the whole system so that people in the growing end can make reasonable living, and those kinds of things. So I think we will still be trading, but it will be more carefully. And at least that would be my hope. And I think that's already happening, not always for good reason. Some of it's sort of political tribalism. But I think the outcome, if we can work with it, of eating more regionally, locally grown food is a good thing, because then you can see who's growing it. We have some control over the regulations of how the land is used and those kinds of things. A lot of materials and a lot of things to think about.
I think we're pretty much out of time here, so I would again like to thank Dr. David Waltner Toews very much for speaking to us today. It started off ostensibly about a pandemic, but certainly we've moved into the realm of many of the social issues, food security, wildlife preservation, environmental degradation, climate change, so all of the things that are combining to affect the world that we live in today. And certainly our health and global health are much more complicated than anyone could ever have foreseen before we started moving into the current date. So thank you again, David, for your wonderful talk.
Don't let it paralyze you. Because all these things are up in the air means that there are tremendous opportunities for making changes, for engaging, for co-creating a better future for ourselves and other species on the planet.